Hey everyone, I'm Brian Bates, and I trust Google Maps without questioning it.
West on.
I'm Linda DeYoung, and I unironically use the Kahoot music at parties.
And this is the One-to-One podcast, brought to you by the Learning Technology Center.
Well, hello everyone, and welcome back to another episode of the One-to-One podcast. Linda, how are you? You make it through the holidays?
Yeah, I'm doing well. We're finally holidays behind us, and all the preparation that comes with that. And I'm excited to get back into talking to some people. And of course, it's nice to see you again, Brian.
Yeah, it's great. And the one thing about once the holidays end, especially when you're talking about the school calendar, is you are now in the downhill slope to the rest of the school year. So we've got a lot of great guests lined up for the second half of our season. We've got a great one today, especially, and it's going to be a big one. So I think without further ado, we should just get into it. Today, we are going to be looking at how we're seeing AI policies play out at both the state and national level. So without further ado, let's start our episode.
Yeah, let's get into it. And this is a super important topic because there's a lot happening at the state and federal level. But before we get into it, let's, of course, take some time to look at news you can use. This is our segment where we look at some recent headlines with technology, something that caught our attention, and we kind of unpack it. And when I found this article, it reminded me of a previous episode, and it was actually during like a get to know you activity where we talked about whether we would want drones following us around, protecting us, capturing moments in our lives. And I remember during that episode, we were both kind of hesitant about the idea of like a personal drone. So I'm curious, like, do you still feel the same about that? Have you changed?
I do remember that conversation, and I don't think I really changed much. It's the I don't know. I don't necessarily think I like the idea of something just floating around above me, watching me, following me, tracking me,
surveilling you.
Yeah.
So it's very interesting because I think when we think of drones, this is something we think about as being like in the future, especially when it comes to like personal kind of surveillance drones. But the article I found today comes from Blue Springs, Missouri, and they've actually invested $4.6 million for drone as first responder technology. And their goal is to deploy drones to respond to emergency calls and investigate potential crime scenes and just generally increase public safety. And their goal is to do it in under 2 minutes, which is obviously much faster than traditional methods where it's a person or a group of people being dispatched to a scene. So, I mean, what do you think about this idea of drone first responder tech?
Well, I think the first thing that pops up when you started talking about this is the location.
Mm-hmm.
I was expecting a population dense, large urban area, thinking about, gridlock that can happen with police cars trying to respond or fire. But then you're talking about a city in Missouri, which it wouldn't have been atop my list. We'll put it that way as far as cities where this might happen. But I mean, it makes a lot of sense in terms of the time and getting to an emergency on time, doing it in a way that is safe and effective. You think about the police, a police car or an ambulance flying down the road. Probably a lot easier for a drone to be flying through the air than trying to weave in and out of traffic to respond to an emergency. I think it's really interesting.
Yeah, I think it's interesting too. My initial thought with this was, how exactly is the drone going to like intervene or respond in like a helpful way? They mentioned in the article about like maybe potentially sending video or images to the teams that are actually going to then like come onto the scene. So the drone would kind of be like the first thing on the scene to be able to send like updated images, videos, like here's what's happening. And that way the actual officers or, medical professionals who are like on their way to the scene would kind of have an idea of like what they're up against or what's going on as they're en route to the scene. So I don't know, like, But again, I'm wondering, like, how is this going to practically help if you just have like a drone hovering above a crime scene?
Yeah. Like what you mentioned there, that makes a lot of sense, especially with like emergency responding to natural disasters. I'm thinking like flooding, for example.
Yeah.
Rather than putting someone at jeopardy and getting them out into a situation where floodwaters might be dangerous if they're now I recognize that, it's probably not a great idea to have drones flying around in thunderstorms or heavy rains.
Right.
I get that, but out in the aftermath and things like that, I feel like there's a lot more positive here
hmm
than I feel like there is negative.
Yeah, I think even when we were seeing, the wildfires happening I don't know if it was this summer or the summer before, but I think I remember them using drone technology to do some actual like firefighting techniques too, where they were like dousing the area in water or other types of like flame quenchers,
Mhm.
and I thought that was really interesting too, because you're right, like it's much safer than a person having to go into a very dangerous situation like a wildfire and having to
Mhm.
like fight that on the ground.
Yeah.
So coming back to this article a little bit, their goal in Blue Springs is to make it a flock safe city. And I was immediately like, what does that mean? What is flock safe?
Yeah, I would agree.
So I did a little digging into what that meant. And Flock Safety is a company that utilizes technology solutions in the attempt to create safer communities. And they offer what is essentially a lot of surveillance services like drones, cameras, audio detection, license plate readers, things like that. And I think it makes total sense that there are companies offering these comprehensive kind of plans and programs for safety in cities. But I don't know, didn't sit right with me there either. How do you feel about localizing city safety into like a solution like that into one company?
Well, I think that I shouldn't say most, but I think you're going to see a lot of complaints about privatizing
hmm
public safety, and just anytime you get money involved and paying a company to provide public safety, I think that that's going to ruffle some feathers a little bit.
hmm
Um, I, I don't know. It's interesting because you think about the idea of, okay, if it's responding to a situation, something has happened and it's going to actually respond to a situation. That's one thing. But this is monitoring prior to in the ways that it looks like this audio detection, license plate readers. It's tracking and monitoring at all times and then going back and be like, oh, hey, something happened at this time. We need to go see. So I think it's going to be another concern for some people as an invasion of privacy of like, well, you're telling me that everywhere I go, everything I do is going to be recorded in some way.
hmm
That's not cool. And what happens to all that data? And I don't blame them.
No.
Um, so I think that raises a lot of questions and concerns there.
Yeah, I had similar questions and concerns. We know that data privacy is becoming more and more important. It always was important, but it's becoming increasingly more important. We're seeing these huge data breaches and leaks. And
Mhm.
especially when you're dealing with, something that's monitoring a city, a people, a community at all times, that's a massive amount of personal data. And the question is begged, like, what is going to be done with that data, and what happens if that data gets leaked? It could be like a massive invasion of privacy. So I don't know.
Yeah.
I think the idea of like a city that is safe, a block safe city where it's like utilizing technology to make safer communities. I mean, we see similar things in like places like Singapore.
Mhm.
I think that that's a noble pursuit, but also I think it does raise a lot of questions too about what exactly does that mean for a company to take that under their wing.
And I think it's easy for me to sit here and say, like, okay, how do I feel about this as someone who is, I mean, you have to believe me when I say I'm not out there doing wrong or trying to commit crime, do things, but then I, as you were just kind of mentioning, I thought to myself, well, what if I'm on the other side of this? What if something has happened to me? Crime has been committed against me, against one of my loved ones or something like that. And this technology allows them to capture the person who committed that crime that much quicker or that much easier, or
Right.
does it before it creates a larger um, issue, for lack of a better term. How would I feel about it then? So I don't know I think it's an interesting kind of ethical debate and conversation to continue to have as these things keep continually pop up.
Yeah, I agree. So, for those of you listening, if you're interested in reading this article for yourself, maybe sharing it with others and having a similar debate about how do you feel about this, about personal drone technology, about these ideas of like technology surveillance in cities, we'll go ahead and link that in the show notes for you so that you can access that article for yourself. All right, so let's go ahead and get into today's episode. We're going to take a look at some of the recent news at both the federal and state levels in regards to education. And a lot of you have been hearing about changes happening federally. I'm sure you have as well, Brian. One of the biggest of these is the proposed redistribution of the Department of Education across other federal agencies. And we know here at the LTC, and just personally, it can be hard to make sense of what this all actually means because it's very complex. And so our goal today is to break things down in an accessible way, whether you're a classroom teacher or a school leader or a superintendent that's working with your community so that you can navigate some of these changes. Just a note that we're going to do our best to approach these topics thoughtfully and as fairly as possible. We know that conversations like this can feel complicated and at times are sensitive. A note that any opinions shared by our hosts or today's guests are their own and don't necessarily reflect the views of the Learning Technology Center as an organization. We also want to mention that this episode is releasing in January of 2026. So if you're listening to this at a later date, there may be a lot of updates to what we covered today. Things are fast moving sometimes, and sometimes they're slow moving. So just make sure that you're educating yourself on what the current state is in the federal and state governments. So with that in mind, we hope that this conversation today helps to bring a little clarity to some very uncertain and involving developments. So Brian, are you ready to welcome Mindy to today's episode?
Sure, let's go for it. Well, today's guest is Mindy Fiscus, one of Illinois' leading voices in state and federal education policy. As the Director of Government Affairs and Purchasing for the Learning Technology Center and a 20-year ed tech veteran, Mindy serves as an Illinois State E-Rate Coordinator, the state's representative on the State Educational Technology Directors Association Board, and a core member of the Illinois Classroom Connectivity Initiative, a partnership that includes ISB, the Department of Innovation and Technology, and the Governor's Office. She has deep expertise navigating federal programs, shaping state initiatives, and guiding districts through complex funding and policy landscapes. Mindy was also named CETA's 2023 State Leader of the Year. Mindy, welcome to our podcast.
Thank you, Brian. And thank you, Linda, for having me. I'm happy to be here today.
Happy to have you.
Mindy, thanks for joining us. It's great to have you on. And, today, before we get started, I know Brian and I know you very well, being fellow LTC members, but we always like to start off by getting to know our guests with a little game, a way to learn more about you and for our listeners to learn more about you. So do you think that you're down to play a game with us?
Yes, but I'm nervous, but go ahead.
I'm very excited for this
They
one.
always end up fun. Linda always has good ones. They always end up really interesting and exciting. So I think you're going to be fine.
Thanks. I am especially excited about this one because I based it off of the meme of the guy sitting at the table on the college campus, and he has a big sign taped to the front of the table that just says, "Change my mind." Have you seen this meme?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And the idea, for those of you who don't know, is that the guy sitting there at the table has an idea that he's going to defend until the very end, and it would be very hard for you to change his mind. And so today's game is called Change My Mind. And here's how it works. So I'm going to give you a concept, and you're going to have to defend it like you're its biggest champion. And you're basically going to be the Change My Mind guy. For example, I could say 8 a.m. meetings, and you would have to come up with a reason why it's amazing to have 8 a.m. meetings. You would defend it to the end of your days. So are you ready to play Change My Mind?
I'm ready.
All right. So the first one is hitting reply all on staff emails.
I just think it's really, really great if we are all informed and all in the loop about all activities that are happening within our organization. Just think how better in sync we could be if we all just replied all.
I couldn't agree more.
This is going to be great.
We love reply alling. It's the best thing ever. The next one, Having 50 tabs open as an organization strategy.
Well, everything's right on this is for real. I think that's a fantastic idea. Everything's right at your disposal. You can just flick between all the things. As a self-proclaimed ADHD person, that's necessary. I don't even know why we're defending it.
This is just your normal.
Yeah.
Really, 50 tabs. It's fine.
And multiple windows up and down with 50 tabs. I think it's a fantastic idea. I don't know why you wouldn't.
How about drinking an energy drink for breakfast?
How is that any different than coffee? It's what, half of the nation does every day.
Thank you. As an energy drink person, I thank you.
I agree.
Unless you're my 16-year-old son who tries to do it every morning, and I'd rather he not. But for, adults.
That's fair.
And if you're listening to this 16-year-old son, you better stop drinking those. It's bad for you.
He doesn't listen to me, but he might listen to you, Linda.
That's true. How about replying to an email with, per my last email?
Sometimes the workplace requires passive aggressiveness, and I'm here for it.
You put your stamp of approval on that, Mindy. And then finally, sending a long voice memo instead of a text.
Texts can only get out the thoughts and not the intention and the inflection behind the thoughts. And voice memos can really add more to the context in thoughts and emotions and feelings.
And that is the game Change My Mind. Good job, Mindy.
Oh,
I wanted to comment on all of it. That's so hard.
So not commenting was harder for Brian than just making up answers was for me.
Yeah.
Well, thanks for playing. I always enjoy them, and you did a great job. I love the Change My Mind. I feel like there's lots of things that I have strong opinions on where I'm like, change my mind.
Well, I get the privilege of shifting from a fun, exciting game to the serious conversation of the day, which it is going to be fun and exciting. I promise you that. Just not quite gamified. Here's kind of a brief rundown of what we're going to cover during today's episode. First, at the top of everyone's mind, the redistribution of the Department of Ed. We'll spend most of our time there. After that, we're going to switch over and we're going to cover some funding updates. We're going to include E-rate in that, ESSER funds, and broadband funding. So thanks for being here and going through those things with us. And let's go ahead and dive into some of these topics now. The first thing we kind of wanted to discuss today is the most significant educational news at the federal level has been the redistribution of the Department of Ed into various other U.S. federal departments. If you're like me, if you're like Linda, Linda and I had conversations about all these topics and all these questions. And maybe our listeners are in the same boat too. It can be difficult to make sense of what that exactly means. So can you give us a simple overview to start of what that means?
Sure. And first, let me start with, don't believe everything that you read on the internet as a predecessor to this. Or take everything into heart. So we're living in a unique new world right now in our political structure. And I think that you'll kind of feel that from my responses to the questions moving forward today. Remember that when they say something, especially from the federal level, that many of those impacts won't be felt for 12 to 24 months. And so panicking, which is what a lot of people are doing with a lot of this in particular, is not necessary at this point. So that's the first thing I have to say. The wheels move very slowly at the federal level. And a lot of things that we are seeing aren't leading to immediate action right now. And we can talk a little bit more about how the things are coming out and what those look like throughout today's podcast. It's really important to note that there was an executive order from the president's office in March of 25, so almost a year ago, that said he intended to close the Department of Ed. And again, everyone freaked out a little bit, understandably. Many of us use the Department of Ed for guidance on a lot of different issues. And so here we are almost a year later, and just in November, I believe it was the 18th, there was an announcement made by the Secretary of Education, McMahon, that there are multiple intergovernmental agreements signed with multiple different agencies to cover some of the work that has been given to the Department of Ed. This does not mean that they are redistributing everything. This also doesn't mean that they are doing away with the Department of Ed as a whole. So people are kind of taking those two announcements and grouping them together and saying, this is action that's going to happen. And in both cases, they don't really they can shift the work, which is what the November announcement has made. They can shift some of the work. They can't really do away with the Department of Ed with a proclamation. That is something that has to go before Congress. Congress has to make the decision to dissolve the Department of Ed. That in itself will have conversation and debate and have to be put into a bill that will then work through the channels to become a law if it even gets to that point. The reason and rationale for these motions is to break up the federal education bureaucracy. And I think that there's two sides to every story, and we'll go through some of those different sides today. But I think it's important to remember that some things are broken and could benefit from these conversations. And some things are in place and would continue to operate better with these situations and structures in place. So what we'll say is that even though these things are being discussed, it's still in discussion phases. Things are still being talked about, how things will be done, and there's pros and cons to every action. And again, the wheels are moving quite slowly from the federal level. An announcement doesn't mean anything that's immediate, and we might see things taken in pieces or done over time. Does that make you feel better already?
Yeah.
I think it's important to know that, I mean, it's just like any other major change like this would be. It takes time. And like you're saying, 12 to 24 months or even, more or less in some capacities. But like it's not going to change overnight. It's not going to change by the end of the school year. And we just have to kind of see where things go and take things with a grain of salt. It's kind of what I'm hearing.
And sometimes what we're living right now and things that are happening even at our state level, people mix up with the federal level. And so you'll start experiencing grants and changes in funding, et cetera, that are happening here locally. But those decisions were made a year ago, and you're just now feeling that impact. And so sometimes, you're reacting to something in real time, and sometimes you're reacting to something that may or may not happen in time to come.
That makes sense.
Mindy, do you mind giving just like a real brief, thing about the restructuring, kind of like what should people understand about the nature of the restructuring, where things have been moved, what that might mean? Can you give us just a broad overview of that?
Sure. So first, restructuring is a strong word, right? So the work and the responsibility for the work still resides in the U.S. Department of Education. If and until there is some kind of a bill that will get rid of that organization, they are still responsible for how that work gets done. What they have decided is to offload some of the programs that are under the Department of Ed to other agencies that they think might shed some new light on the project. And so it is not everything that the U.S. Department of Ed does. It is only some of the things and some choice things that are going to different departments. So for example, there is a intergovernmental agreement with the Department of Labor, and they're asking the Department of Labor to handle the distribution and organization of K-12 title funding, which is the largest amount of money that comes from the federal government out to the states and then eventually to the schools. And so instead of managing and figuring out how much money everybody's getting and how that's being spent and all the different title programming, they're saying we're going to let the Department of Labor do that. In turn, they're also there are some things that are impacted from that. So like our community learning centers, our homeless liaisons, and our homeless student supports, other grant programs that go to like magnet and charter schools and things like that all come out of this title funding, as well as it's a primary source for professional learning for teachers. Mm-hmm. And aides in classrooms that support schools that are low income. So a lot of those programs that fund the extras, I hate to call them extras, but the extras in our schools are funded by these title funds. So anytime that anybody wants to mess with that or upset that apple cart, people get a little bit nervous, and I can understand why. It's not to say that those funds are going away. It's just to say that they will be managed and distributed by the Department of Labor. It's not just K-12. So some of the other programs that would be handled by the Department of Labor are like higher ed funding for some of these kinds of services, as well as TRIO, which, if you're familiar with it, is a program for first generation college students that we see. It kind of impacts both high school and community college/college groups. So it's extra supports for those students to get them application process, like through the application process for college, et cetera, and encourage first generation college students to go to college. And so a lot of those programs that we see a lot in Illinois, especially in our rural parts of Illinois, risk some uneasiness when it moves to another department. We see a lot of funding through these programs for like our historically black colleges nationally. And we've got, some heavily performing schools that are funded by that in Illinois as well. And so when you see that it's shifting to a different manner, it gives you a little unease, and you start thinking things like, okay, who will my contact be? And who are the people who have been answering these questions about how these funds can be spent? And if I can use this for school supplies, or if I have to use it for professional learning, like those kinds of questions and things that have been answered back in the day. A school district calls the state says, here's the answer that we've been given by the federal government. And so in essence, transferring these decisions to the states without that federal government support that they know and trust to answer those questions creates a little bit of unease. The other programs and finances that we see shifting and moving around, some of the things are going to the Department of Health and Human Services. And a lot of this is like the foreign education systems. So things that students that are attending school in other countries, but getting, U.S. accreditation and things for those services. So foreign exchange students and things like that. Childcare access for universities is part of that whole Department of Health and Human Services. So again, not everything in those departments that deal with higher ed and K-12, but just some of the programs, kind of like they're piloting or piecing it out. What I found was really interesting, and we don't deal with a lot of it in Illinois, is that they moved a lot of the services for Native American education that they would, of course, take advantage of in like New Mexico and Arizona and things like that, but we don't see a lot of that in Illinois. So they moved Native America programming into the Department of Interior, which is an interesting move. And one might say that the Department of Interior would better understand their needs than the Department of Education, right? So maybe that would be a good move. Maybe it wouldn't. Being from Illinois and not interacting with those funding sources, I'm not sure the benefit or the perceived benefit or the damage that could cause. The last one, I think there were 6 agreements total, 2 for a couple of the departments. And then the last one was the Department of State. And it was centering around international education again, and foreign language, et cetera. The one thing that we don't see anywhere here is anything that has to do with DODEA, which is the Department of Education for our service members, students around the world, right? So that already isn't in the Department of Education. They tackle all of that in, their own systems of support for the military. And so some of these things being in different places could cause us to be concerned about the kinds of answers that we're going to get or who's going to be there to answer those questions. But at the same time, they could give us a new perspective from those agencies who work with those segments of our learners that might have some interesting insights. I think the biggest concern that we are seeing and hearing about is that the bulk of the title funds moving to the Department of Labor is concerning. It feels like on paper that we're pushing those funding sources to the Department of Labor to give out and in order to funnel better workers for our labor markets.
I've heard that.
That's the big underlying, if we give it to the Department of Labor, we're going to go back to the 1950s where we're creating, factory workers that get in line and do what we want them to, instead of free thinking individuals like yourselves. So the work is still going to get done. It just might get done in a different way. And know that even though the announcement has been made and the work has shifted, it hasn't really yet. So the wheels are turning and the conversations have started and intergovernmental agreements have been signed. That's step one. And in the meantime, there are a couple of senators. One of them is Patty Murray from Washington. Another one is Tammy Baldwin from Wisconsin, both Democrats, who are leading the charge to say this is not how this should be done, right? And I think they're operating on the preface of you're moving things away from the Department of Ed so that you can more easily get rid of the Department of Ed because they won't be the ones doing that work anymore, right? So their concern is saving the pieces that are still left at the Department of Ed and saying you can't just piecemeal it out to other entities in your efforts to dismantle. And so they are putting together and seem to have bipartisan support at this point, an effort in our next budget talks that will be an amendment to whatever kind of law that they pass that will stop this from happening, right? Prohibit them from doing this. If they get enough votes, if they get the amendment added, if that bill passes in a timely enough manner to have impact, then that's something, that we'll take a look at. In the meantime, we're facing bigger problems in our nation, right? Like we've got a budget that was a temporary budget that we got through negotiation or lack thereof in the fall, right? So we had a shutdown of our government because we didn't have a budget in place, and they finally said, okay, we're going to do a continuing resolution. So a CR, they call it. The CR is like a pause button, right? So we're just going to keep everything as it is right now, and this will further the negotiations, reopen the government, fund everything for now as we keep negotiating. And so we're on a CR that takes us till the end of January. And then we might find ourselves in the same situation that we were before. And education is only one piece of that whole conversation. And now we have, international affairs to think about here after January, in addition to education in that budget. And so some of the things that in the negotiations happen might be, we're going to hands off education for a bit while we focus on some of these other areas. Totally possible. Again, it's not everything that the Department of Ed does, but the title funding is a big chunk of the federal funding that we see. So we don't know yet how it will be handled in the Department of Labor, who will be handling it. It could be the same people who left the Department of Ed get hired by the Department of Labor, and the same people are dealing with it over there. It very well could be.
Well, it's interesting. There's a lot there as to what is changing, but also at the same time, what's not. I like the fact that you kind of pointed out, hey, there are some instances here where maybe a fresh perspective might be beneficial for this program. Maybe it's in a department where those people might know those learners best and find. So you're doing a nice job of also framing that there are some positive potential outcomes to this.
Well, and just because we've always done something a certain way doesn't mean that's the only way to do it.
That's right.
Whether it's in the Department of Labor, the Department of State, or the Department of Ed, sometimes fresh eyes are needed. Yeah.
I want to kind of stay with that idea of the positives and the negatives, what you're hearing from both sides. So since this announcement, there's been a really strong reaction from federal representatives, state representatives, journalists, schools, and districts across the country. You've got people who are in favor of this. You've got people who are strongly opposed to it. And others aren't saying much or just kind of staying in the middle. What are you hearing from different perspectives? What are the different thoughts that you're hearing?
It's interesting that you put it that way. And it's, again, I said earlier, it's important to remember you can't believe everything that you read online. And I tried to find some resources, I really did, to put together to send with our listeners so that they could learn some stuff further. And one of the struggles that I was having, and the reason why I didn't put any links forward, is that a lot of it is written in legalese. It isn't the common understood language. And a lot of it is clearly tilted towards one side or the other. So you've got kind of two camps. You've got those that are for this move, who think it's a good thing, that think that moving the funding to the departments that are better suited to projects related to that funding is a good move. They think the system's broken. They think new thoughts and opinions will really shake things up and give us some new ways of doing things. And they also, some of them were even reported in things online saying, like, I don't really care who sends me the money as long as the money comes, right? Like they're, in the preface that states will be in control, there are some states that are super excited about being in control and having less regulations on the funds that will be coming to them. And they can spend and do with them what they want without some of the red tape. But those against the idea are coming out and saying, hey, this is going to create confusion. It's going to lead to less collaboration. People are going to be working in silos more than they already are. People aren't going to know who to communicate with and how to get those questions answered. Some have even expressed they have concerns about the capacity of the departments that are taking the work to do that work. Some of those departments are kind of looking at hiring some of the people who got fired from the Department of Ed. So like they cut about 50% of the staff of the Department of Ed already before this announcement was made. And so who's going to do that work? Do they have the expertise they need? Will this be a rough transition, et cetera? It more though, at the national level, when you see the concerns from a political nature, they're concerned about this is step one to dissolving the Department of Education. And there's some people who feel very strongly about the purpose of the Department of Education is to make sure that our workforce isn't influenced by labor and markets, to make sure that we have students that can enter a wealth of pathways and higher education, et cetera. And so overall, the impact is going to be that it's going to change who the sources of authority are. And the sources of authority might end up being more local. And it might be our state people who are making those decisions. And one of the, pro or con, either way, I'm not sure, one of the concerns that I have in working with multiple states is then you'll get different answers from different states. And so like, I'll just use Illinois and Indiana as an example. Illinois has a very, very strong and embedded into our system pre-K system for early childhood and children starting school early. And we have done studies and we know the benefits of that. And we heavily support it with our state funds. Indiana doesn't require kindergarten. Well, we don't either, but they don't have hardly any structures for that early childhood system over there. So if you're given funds and early childhood spending is one of those expenditures, Illinois is going to carve out some for that. Indiana, probably not. On the same aspect, Indiana allows for virtual schools. And so if you're an Indiana student and your school district doesn't offer you a virtual high school to attend, but you want to, you can petition to go to any other virtual school in any other county in the state because it's virtual. Illinois has no virtual schools, period. If you're getting virtual programming, you're getting it from a high school that is brick and mortar that will give you the credit and the degree for whatever virtual program you have taken. And so two totally different things, two totally different states, and two totally different aspects of how to handle things. As the funding comes to the states to make those decisions, states are naturally going to lean into the things that they're passionate about, early childhood or virtual learning. So we're going to see a discrepancy from state to state, I think, on the kinds of things that are being offered. And that might work well for you and your student in a certain state. But what if you move to a different state? And then what will that look like? And how is that going to adjust our students from state to state? Just because there's a river between us doesn't mean it changes the whole world that we live in.
Yeah, I think that those are all perspectives that I've been seeing as well as I've been looking into this issue. There are a lot of concerns around, on one side, equity and how this is going to impact equity across states, and also equity in funding. But then, like you said, on the other side, there has always been kind of a disgruntledness with the bureaucracy of it all. And that also has felt broken at times. And so people are reacting to these different things happening, based on things that are already kind of broken in our system, and whether or not this is going to improve or even further break some of the things that we're experiencing.
And I think the biggest test is going to be years to come when we have parents who are fighting for services for their child special ed's a great example for that, and the state's not delivering, or the system's not delivering, and then you take that to the state and the state's not delivering because they've decided that that's not something we're going to require. And right now the parents can lean on, but the U.S. Department of Ed says you must, right? And I think that there's some concern that they won't have that final say-so to back them up when it comes to those plights that they have. And we hear about those every day in the court systems.
Mhm.
So.
And as we're hearing about, all these different opinions, because you've been hearing it, Mindy, I've been hearing it as well. I've also been hearing a lot of misinformation around this issue because it is a complex issue to navigate. There are obvious reasons for people to be anxious. And so when they're seeing misinformation, it's causing more of that anxiety. And I'd love to address a few of those pieces of misinformation that I've been hearing, if you're up to kind of talk about them.
Sure. What
So-
have you heard, Linda?
Yeah, I've been hearing all kinds of things. So one of the things that I've heard, the most common one that I've heard, is that the Department of Education has just been completely abolished. It's gutted. It no longer exists. So what do you have to say to that?
It hasn't. It would take an act of Congress. Some would say not yet. Some would say that's never going to happen. So, we'll just have to wait and see how things go. But it's definitely not the case for right now.
Mm-hmm. I also think, as you've touched on, people have said, like you've said, a lot of this has to do with funding, right? Like people are worried about their funding sources. And so I've heard misinformation about how all of schools' funding comes from the federal government, or most of their funding does. And so now they're like, schools are no longer going to be funded because now that the Department of Ed is splitting and some people think it's abolished, now there's no funding. So schools are not going to be funded.
So that is the biggest one, I think, that I'm hearing. And so in reality, the majority of school funding comes from your state, comes from local state taxpayer funds that fund your school. So really only 10% of the funding comes from those federal programs. 90% of the funding, and in our state, we call that evidence-based funding model, that's all state funds. So the states are primarily funded by those local taxes and those local funds that are distributed by their state. Only about 10% of those funds come from those federal funding sources. That being said, that's not exact, right? Like if you are a really impoverished area, more of your funds might come from the federal funding, right? Because those are the programs, like I said, the extra, the special programs, those for those who have lots of kids who get free and reduced lunch and are in high need, who need extra supports for whatever reason, a higher population of those that, meet certain guidelines. And so therefore, those programs are funded. Those extra programs, the after school programs, the extra aids in the classrooms, things like that are the ones that are usually funded by federal funding. In the lapse of federal funding, sometimes school districts will make the priority to continue to fund those positions and those people with their local funds. It's just right now they're able to pay for that out of that 10%.
And then finally, I think one of the other major ones I've been hearing is, we have a funding bill coming up in the future here, and people are worried that basically the funding is going to be removed completely for education from that bill. It's going to be not reflected in the bill. So maybe talk a little bit about what is that bill and why that's not the case.
So part of this, I should preface with, my insights on this topic come from people that I work with at the federal level who are lobbyists that work in education, right? Who live, eat, and breathe in the DC space. And they kind of look at you and roll your eyes when you get panicked about that and say, nobody's going to screw around with education funding, right? Like education funding is a lot of votes. When people get upset about education funding, your legislators hear about it. They don't want your phone calls. They don't want you to be mad at them. They don't want to hear from the taxpayers about their education funding. So they tend to not mess with it. For the things that are broken in the system, there's a lot more that's going on that's right. And they don't want to upset that apple cart. So the funding will remain. No one's coming in and saying, we're going to give you less. What they're saying is, if you look at some of these sources that give you a list of the title funding programs that your school is taking advantage of, we might collapse that list. And instead of saying you must spend this much in this category and this much in this category, and make sure you cover this and make sure you cover that, we might give you a block grant that would collapse all those funding categories into one. And then they will say to you, do with it as best fits your school district. Some people might like that idea, right? Yeah. However, those who are the marginalized students, who might be your homeless students, or the schools that aren't getting enough teacher training already, when the school's not told you have to spend 20% of this on teacher training, might not have teacher training, right? And so there's some concern one way or another, but nobody's really saying that the funding is going away. My personal opinion is, when you group everything into a block grant like that, even with or without those restrictions that I just talked about, it's easier as a whole to cut a percentage than it is to cut a certain line of that program. So they're not talking about giving us less money now, but if they group it into a block grant, will that be easier for them to make a move like that in the future, is a good question. Again, if you group it all together and you have less stories and you have less detail to explain what that money is being used for, it's easier to say that it's unnecessary. But right now, in the billing structure and the process structure that we're seeing with forming budgets right now, there's no major changes, with the exception of maybe grouping some of these things into larger groups.
Well, as I mentioned at the top of our episode, we were going to kind of cover a few different topics, and we've been talking a little bit here in the last few minutes about budgets and funding and things like that. So I think this is a good time to transition and pivot to some other federal and Illinois state updates, starting with E-rate. Could you give us a quick update on E-rate and what districts should know right now?
So first, what needs to be stated out loud, and I need everybody to hear me, is E-rate isn't going anywhere. So I hear that a lot. Like, I heard E-rate was going away. Is E-rate going to be here for this next year? E-rate is not going anywhere. E-rate was put into the FCC in the late 90s by Congress. It has remained there. There were some very interesting court cases last year. And so going all the way to the Supreme Court. And for those of you who don't really follow that structure, when there are differences of opinion in lower courts, the Supreme Court is then forced with making a decision and deciding the ultimate decision. And so one court case said this program is being mismanaged. It's been given to the SEC, and the SEC is offloading too much information to their nonprofit USAC, who manages the program, and the money's being collected wrong. And it's a tax and not a fee. And here's all the things that are wrong with the program. And this other court said, same people writing the lawsuit, I totally disagree. It's fine the way it is, right? And so then there was like this one with all the problems and all pointing out all the issues got more news cycle, right?
Imagine that.
So, imagine that. So by the time it got to the Supreme Court had to make a decision and basically came out and said, this is a very important program. This is the biggest amount of funding for educational technology that we have across the nation. And frankly, school districts couldn't pay for their internet and offer the services they have without this program.
Right.
They heard it loud and clear. Nobody is saying that the program itself shouldn't be here or was going away. It was the management of the program and the collection of funds towards that program that was questioned. And the Supreme Court said, it's fine, leave it alone. They said it in like a 20-page document of legalese. I'm just saying, it said, it's fine. They're fine. Continue doing what you're doing. Leave it alone. There was not huge evidences of fraud and abuse. There was not huge evidences that this funding wasn't getting to the people it was meant to serve. It's fine. Leave it alone. Let's move forward. There will be some baby steps forward, I think, and changes as a result of this whole conversation over the last year or so. I think there will be a focus on trying to make cybersecurity services eligible for the program in the future. Right now, we have a cybersecurity pilot. They've kind of said they're not going to make any decisions on including that in E-rate until they see the pilot, learn from it, know what they want to include moving forward. So we've got 2 or 3 years to watch that pilot run out. But they're listening at the FCC level. that the lawyers are hearing, it's not good enough to just have internet anymore. You have to have internet that's protected and safe and not, it's a bunch of student data. Let's protect that data. So that's being heard. I think too, it's important that internet is the primary. That's what you hear about all the time. But the program also covers category 2, which is network equipment. So it covers everything that the internet to the world and everything that gets that internet to your computers. It doesn't cover computers and devices, et cetera, that we saw a huge embracing of during COVID, but it does cover the internet for the use of those devices. And so there's a whole nother funding source. There's a 5-year budget that was just announced per student amount that you can calculate and leverage anytime over the next 5 years to help refresh and replace those network equipment pieces, the wireless access points, et cetera, throughout your building to make sure that people have access to the internet that the program is supporting. So I could spend all day talking about E-rate, but I know Brian doesn't want to.
You are the E-rate queen.
The one who asked the question. I asked because I wanted to know.
It is important to know, especially for those of our listeners who are from other states, that every state does have a state E-rate coordinator who helps people through the process of applying for E-rate. Not every state E-rate coordinator is as hands-on and click that button, not this one, as I am, but there is someone in your state that can answer questions about the program and help you find the right resources for applying. So I encourage you to go out and check that out. For those of you who are in the state of Illinois, we offer those services for free. So do check out the LTC services for E-rate. We have all kinds of virtual training and support and videos where we help you through that application process. And if nothing else, you can just call or email me and I will give you my answer or find out the answer for you.
Well, Mindy, let's talk about one more form of funding here, or funding source, which is ESSER funds. And if listeners who are listening who don't know what ESSER funds were, these were funds from the COVID years that districts were using to fund like everything from tech to instructional coaches to upgrades to professional learning. Like they were using ESSER funds for a lot of different things.
Hand sanitizer.
Right, hand sanitizer. But we know now that ESSER funds are going to be cut off officially. So how are districts handling this funding stream disappearing? What are you seeing?
So first of all, it's probably already gone. So if you're listening to it now, don't go, oh, let me get those funds before they're gone. They're probably already gone. They're probably all been expended already. And the shifts are already taking place. You just may or may not know it. So a lot of that funding was a result of school districts that weren't one-to-one, which every laptop for every student had to be to do virtual learning opportunities with COVID. So when COVID hit, schools that didn't have that one-to-one device ratio went out and they spent the funds to get those devices, to put them in the hands of kids to teach them. And then all the kids came back to school and they were like, now what do we do with these things? And so we started adapting our teaching and learning to these devices and having these devices at our disposal, et cetera. And I think there was a big concern that people would be like, oh, good, that's gone, and throw those devices in a closet. But that is not what happened. And so school districts really embraced and started changing the way that they teach to leverage these devices that they had for every student. And as a result, school districts started making some tough decisions when the funding sources went away earlier this year of what are we not going to have so that we can have these Chromebooks or these laptops or iPads, depending on the school district. And so as they are shifting, some school districts are choosing to implement like a technology fee where everyone pays a certain technology fee that will help pay for a device for that student over X number of years. Some school districts are opting for online learning resources instead of textbooks and using their textbooks funds to pay for these devices. What we did see was a lot of available funding for teachers to do new and creative things.
Right.
Pull teachers out of a classroom and allow that teacher to become a coach and work with other teachers, to become a specialist in a certain subject area or a technology or a, passion that they have, and pulled them out of the classroom and let them do what they're really, really good at. And now when the funding is gone, they're like, sorry, Mrs. Smith, we need you back in second grade, right? Because those evidence-based funding formulas are paying for the second grade teacher. They're not paying for the STEM lab coordinator. And so shifts have been made back to the classroom. We are not, fortunately, fingers crossed, losing that expertise. We're just shifting them back into the school and finding ways for those teachers to maybe in a middle school, high school setting to maybe teach 6 classes instead of 8 and still be available for 2. So they're thinking creatively, they're making priorities, they're shifting back and forth to really talk about what that looks like. And in some cases, it might mean bringing a trainer to your school district to do a training there locally, rather than sending 10 teachers to a national conference or something like that. So I think we're still going to continue to see the shift, and we're going to see some things go by the wayside until there are other funding sources for them. And so I think we're going to get creative at looking at other philanthropy, local grants and funding sources, other ways to fund those programs that we seeded but are going to have some trouble sustaining over the next few years.
Mindy, as we wrap up, I kind of want to do a callback to how we started this conversation. We started this conversation with like you started saying like, hold on, people, wait it, like just relax for a second. This is a time of uncertainty because there are a lot of possible changes that may or may not happen in a time frame that we're not sure of. We know it could be, it most likely will be a long time, but it could be sooner, could never happen. What would you, like, I guess as we kind of wrap up, what would your final like word of advice be to district leaders, school administrators, teachers, any other school staff out there? What would your advice be, or what would you say to them to help make sure that they stay informed about these changes or possible changes, but also not going off the deep end, full panic mode?
Step 1 is please go watch Schoolhouse Rock, How a Bill Becomes a Law. You maybe haven't heard it for a while, but visit it on YouTube. Encourage others to do it too. So people are starting to panic way too early in the process. When something is just introduced, when something is just talked about, and then you're like at, the local Elks Club or something on a Friday night, and they're like, I heard we're banning devices from classrooms. And you're like, okay, some legislator somewhere in the state said maybe we should do that, but like it hasn't even been to a hearing yet. So re-educate yourself on civics lessons and know how things and what process things take. That being said, it's a unique world that we're living in right now. And this is the first time that we've really experienced that proclamation of doing away with things or starting new programs or this is how it's going to be and firing everybody in a department, et cetera, at the national level. And in most cases, the news cycle covers that first announcement. And what they're not covering and you're not hearing about is the group of lawyers that got together and said, that's not legal, and filed a lawsuit. And then that law, and then once that lawsuit is filed, everything pauses, nothing can be done, nothing can be acted on until the court system decides what's happening. And then the court system has, in many cases, sided with the attorneys and said, that's not legal, you can't do that. But the final result of that's not legal, you can't do that, doesn't make the news. Right. It's just that first instance of panic that makes the news cycle. And so it's really important to remember and put that in perspective that you really have to do your homework. That being said, don't be afraid to let your voice be heard. If you start getting form letters from your local teachers association or administrators association that say, now is the time for you to voice your concern, here's a form letter, send it to your legislators, please do. I encourage you to also find out who are your state legislators and who are your federal legislators and know who you're talking to, because you don't want to talk to your state legislators about something that's happening at the federal level or vice versa, right? Two forms of government. Again, let's relearn some civics. If it sounds too good to be true, it probably is. Research it from multiple sources, maybe ones you don't normally go to, because right now what you're getting through the algorithms, no matter what news source you're listening to, are things that you probably agree with. And that's the way that the internet is kind of shaping itself. And so if you're going out and you're irate about something, you're probably going to see articles that support your irateness. And if you go look at a different news source from a different side, you might see a different perspective that you hadn't thought of. Or you might see that what you're being told isn't the whole truth. I'm not saying that it's false, but it might not be the whole truth. Take both of those things into consideration, multiple sources, and then come up with a real reason. And then tell others. Maybe don't start an argument with somebody on social media, but
No?
Go ahead and post an article that you feel is fair and balanced. And then if you have to, turn off the comments. I just showed my uncle how to do that last night. So if you can't handle the comments that are coming your way and you can't hold your composure in social media, recognize that and either get off of social media or turn off the comments or be prepared to defend your case like we did at the beginning with our game.
Well, I guess I'll go delete my burner accounts.
Yeah. Or create multiple burner accounts and fuel all the fury. And then lastly, I have a lot of friends, both at the LTC and multiple agencies and multiple departments in the agency. Please have patience with your people, both at the state and federal level, at all the different levels. And when we tell you that we don't know, that's probably okay. That's probably better than me making up an answer and giving it to you, right? I don't know. This is in process. Ask why, maybe. But sometimes we really don't know. The people who had those answers are now gone. And I don't know who to ask those questions to now. Right. Or I have to go dig out of the archives that I made before they deleted a bunch of stuff off the national websites for articles to support the answer that I'm about to give you. And I know this is happening in not just ed tech, but also in all forms of educational supports that we're seeing. And so be okay with hearing I don't know, and be okay with hearing I'll have to get back to you when a decision is made.
Mindy, thank you so much for that advice. The inner journalism teacher in me is like, yeah, check out those sources. Yeah. And I really appreciate this honest conversation because it really helps to demystify some of the things that are happening. And I hope that our listeners feel a little bit more grounded in this issue and more informed, but also maybe less anxious. And they know where to go from here. If you want to find more about the LTC or Mindy, you can always visit our website and find Mindy's contact information there. Reach out to her if you have questions about E-rate, funding, et cetera, if you just want to connect. And also, like Mindy said, the LTC has a bunch of awesome resources for people to check out. So go ahead and browse our website too to see what we can offer you. But yeah, thank you so much for sitting with us, Mindy. It was a great time.
Thanks for the opportunity and the game.
I'm glad you enjoyed the game. Hopefully things will steady out here a little bit at the federal level as we move forward. But again, Mindy, thanks so much for sitting down with us one-to-one. Do you want to stay in the know about E-rate funding? Well, join Mindy for updates and information about filing. You can see all upcoming events at ltc.site/E-rate.
And the LTC also has a purchasing program called ILTPP to provide discounts from vendors that we contract with. From office supplies to technology, we offer so much. And the best part, joining and accessing the marketplace is free. So learn more about that at ltc.site/ILTPP.
If you want to stay in the know about education, consider following and subscribing to the One-to-One podcast on your streaming platform of choice.
It was great talking with you today, Linda, and I will see you next month where we're going to be sitting down again, one-to-one.